Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Bale. He's professor of sociology, public policy, and data science at Duke University, where he directs the Polarization Lab. Dr. Bale's research examines fundamental questions of social psychology, extremism, and political polarization using social media data, bots, and the latest advances in machine learning. And today we're going to talk mostly about his new book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing. So, Dr. Bale, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so before we get into social media, let me just ask you one or two more general questions. So, are people generally interested in political issues in their daily lives?
Yeah, certainly it depends on which country we're talking about. If we're talking about the United States, many people are surprised to learn that it's really only a small part of the population that cares passionately about politics. And studies have been done to show that a majority of people actually have distaste for politics and would prefer to avoid it when they can.
But do people engage more in political discussion online than they do in their private daily lives or not?
Yeah, that's one of the really interesting things that we were able to study in some of the research that I describe in this new book. Um, you know, Online is a profoundly different environment. Whereas we might be concerned about offending people at, say, a dining room table, online we can interact with varying degrees of anonymity. We can interact with different types of people. And this, in many ways, makes some people feel very comfortable talking about politics.
Some people, but are those the ones that are already interested in politics or not?
Yeah, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, right? What are the motivations for people to talk about politics online? I think what we would like to think is that people are using the internet as kind of the ideal forum for democracy. This is the public square that many old French philosophers envisioned. And even better, it's open to everyone, so anyone could join a debate about politics. But clearly, it has not become that. And when we've done studies, again, in the US, we've shown that about 7% of Twitter users are responsible for about 74% of tweets about politics. So it does seem to be that there's a very small group of people who are highly active. And what's important for your audience to know is that these people have disproportionately extreme views.
But do we find political polarization online?
This is a great question. Where did political polarization come from? I think to answer that question in the US, first of all, polarization in different countries is evolving in different ways. In some countries, polarization is becoming less bad. And in many other countries like the US, it's becoming worse, depending on what we mean by polarization. But by and large, we've seen a trend of increasing polarization, especially negative intergroup attitudes between Republicans and Democrats, since the 1980s. So the root cause of polarization is probably not social media. It's probably things like the rise of cable news networks or negative campaign techniques or various strategies enacted by the Republican and Democratic parties during the 1980s and 1990s. But I think the more important question is, what is social media doing to polarization if it was already on the rise? Is it making it worse or not?
And is it making it worse or not?
This is really a great question, but it's one that's exceptionally difficult to study. It's very hard to imagine a counterfactual world where we didn't have social media. There have been some attempts to, for example, look at the rollout of the internet to different parts of, especially the US, but also to some degree the world, to try to see if access to the internet has been a net gain or a net negative. There have been fewer attempts to understand what happens when people come on to social media or stop using social media. One study indicates that when people stop using social media, they become happier, but also less knowledgeable about politics. The relationship to polarization is a little less clear. But overall, it's probably fair to say that social media is not helping the current issue of polarization in the US.
But do we see higher levels of polarization online than in, let's say, real life? Because I've read some studies that pointed to the fact that when we really directly ask people about different policies and stuff like that, that Republicans and Democrats, for example, tend to give similar answers for most topics. So, I mean, when people talk about political polarization, they make it to be some sort of, some very big problem we have in our hands now, but it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, or is it?
Sure, I think it would depend on the issue we're talking about. But one of the chief arguments I make in this new book is that there's a profound disconnect between what's going on online and what's going on offline. So take, for example, in the US, we've recently had several mass shootings. And, the debate online is as uncivil as ever. People are, angrily recusing each other about, who's to blame and so on. But if we look at the American public, the gap between the percentage of Democrats who support universal background checks for handgun purchases, making it more difficult for people to acquire weapons, and Republicans is only about 5 percentage points. Strong majorities in both parties support this plan, or we could talk about other issues like Biden's plan to address coronavirus as very broad support across parties. But this is not true of every issue. So we shouldn't go so far as to say that America is not a deeply divided country. It is. I think the better question is to what degree is social media stoking fires, creating a false sense of polarization that really might not be there, as much as we might think.
But we aren't sure if that then translates into social media driving political polarization.
Well, I think the key question we should ask is, social media is just changing the way we live in so many ways, right? It's not just politics; it's many other parts of our lives, but especially in an era of increasing social isolation, where we're no longer sitting together in restaurants as often, or meeting each other haphazardly in public spaces. Social media has really come to replace these kind of in-person interactions. And so I think the really interesting question to ask is, how does that change the way we sort ourselves into groups of, and us and them? And, I think that one of the most startling things about social media, and one of the things I write a lot in my new book, is about how it's changed the way that we create our identities.
Right. But is it that when people are exposed to online content, like, for example, during campaigns, when we get online political ads, for example, does that change people's political behavior? For example, their voting behavior?
Sure. A lot of people suspect that campaigns like those by Cambridge Analytica to, say, sway the vote about Brexit in the UK, or to elect former President Donald Trump, were very effective. At least that's what you'd think if you read the media coverage of the issue. But as is true as so many issues about social media, there really isn't much evidence to support this view. The few studies of micro-targeting, the sophisticated kind of micro-targeting tactics that groups like Cambridge Analytica reportedly use, have very little impact. There's one exception. They seem to have some impact in primary elections where the candidates aren't well known. So micro-targeting might be helpful in getting to know someone or bringing them to your attention, but it probably doesn't persuade you or change the way you might vote.
So all of that thing with the Russian bots back in 2016 and stuff like that, I mean, did that really have a big impact on American voters?
That's another great question. Yeah, and it's another one of the myths that I try to address in this new book. We had the opportunity for the first time to link a large amount of social media data to survey data. So we could interview people offline at multiple points, and then we could follow them online as well. one of the things that we were able to do, thanks to collaboration with Twitter and also with the US Intelligence Service, was to create a measure of whether someone interacted with with an account linked to the Russia-linked Internet Research Agency. And of course, there was widespread suspicion that these accounts were spreading misinformation, were polarizing the US, were effectively antagonizing Democrats and Republicans. And so when we went to analyze the data, we suspected we would see that people who interacted with bots were becoming much more radical or adopting stronger partisan views. Instead, we were not able to detect any significant effects of interacting with a bot or a troll account linked to the Russian Internet Research Agency.
Since you mentioned misinformation, I would like to ask you, is misinformation really a big problem or online or not?
I think we're still learning about that right now. We're starting to amass some really good evidence about the scale of misinformation, and we're starting to understand more about how it spreads. We have a little bit of evidence about how it impacts people, and we're starting, perhaps most excitingly, to get some information about how to stop misinformation or stem the tide of misinformation. So the first thing that we've learned is that the scale of misinformation spread, at least during 2016 and 2017, during the U.S. election, was relatively small. So probably, less than 2% of Twitter users, interacted with misinformation, and most Americans, according to one study, only remembered one piece of fake news. Now, they may have been exposed to more than that, but they only remembered one. So that the first thing is that the scale is probably a little less than most people might realize. We're still doing research on misinformation about COVID, and so that may well be different. But so far, the scale of the misinformation spread doesn't seem to be as large as you might think if you were reading the media. The second question, does it impact people? To my knowledge, we only have 2 or 3 studies of this, and all of them suggest that misinformation is not having the strong impact that, again, we might expect if we were only listening to the media. And the third question about how to defeat misinformation is really interesting. It suggests that simple accuracy primes, simply asking people to consider whether something is true before they share it, or become a little more reflective before they share it, seems to strongly discourage the spread of fake news.
In terms of political polarization, does it help if people have contact with views other than the ones they agree with online?
Another myth, another very common myth, is this concept of the echo chamber, that, we are all surrounding ourselves with only like-minded people, and that because we do this, we are insulated from opposing views, and this makes us all more polarized. Some people call this filter bubbles to suggest that social media platforms use algorithms that reinforce this human tendency to surround ourselves with people who already agree with us. There's 2 interesting things about this. First, I, like many others, thought that, okay, well, let's get out of our echo chambers, and maybe this will help us reduce political polarization. So in 2017, we conducted a large study of 1,220 Republicans and Democrats who use Twitter regularly, and we paid about half of them to follow a Twitter bot that we created that exposed them to members of the other side. So journalists, elected officials, advocacy groups, even media organizations. And of course, we thought by interviewing them before and after and asking them a bunch of questions about their political views that we would see people moderate when they were exposed to the other side. Instead, we were very surprised to see that most people actually became more partisan, and especially Republicans. So stepping outside your echo chamber seemed to make people more polarized, not less.
But these are issues that affect both people on the left and the right, or is it a partisan issue?
It's an interesting question. On the left, the effects were smaller, but they were in the same direction. So liberals tended to become more liberal. Republicans tended to become much more Republican or conservative. And this effect held across all sorts of different subgroups. So people often ask me, is this just people with lower education, or is this just people who live in certain regions of the country, or is this people who were already in strong echo chambers to begin with? And the answer, using some of the most sophisticated techniques in machine learning at the time, seems to be no.
Mm-hmm. But talking about the people who are more politically engaged and participate, for example, in political discussions on the internet, is it the case that by participating in those kinds of discussions, they get more extreme?
Right. So this is a really interesting question that cuts back to the core argument of my book. How is social media driving the way that we create our identities? And, really to answer this question, we have to step back and say, well, what are identities? Why do humans have them? Like from an animal's perspective, it's a silly thing to do to care so much about, your identity, right? So we've known for many years that identity serves critical, evolutionary functions to bond people together. But we also know that it's profoundly shaped by our social context. So whether we know it or not, each day we tend to present different versions of ourselves. Right now I'm a professor talking to you on this channel, right? And I'm presenting a very scholarly version of myself, and I won't ever tell you about like what I'm watching on Netflix right now, right? And I'm reading your face for cues about, whether what I'm saying is resonating with you, right? And we do this all the time and in many different contexts. And we read our audience for clues about which types of identities are working, which types of identities people like, and which types of identities make us feel good about ourselves. And so when you think about social media, it's of course profoundly changed all this. The first big change is that we can present really any version of ourselves that we like. So I could become more extreme, less extreme. I could show my face. I could be anonymous, and so on and so forth. So I have much more flexibility in terms of who I can present myself as. But I also have a powerful new apparatus for monitoring who reacts to my identities and how. Right? I have like buttons and follower accounts and so on and so forth. And so the interesting question is, to what extent does the way we understand other people reacting to us drive our quest to create our identities, and often in counterproductive ways? So one of the most interesting parts of the research for this book was watching extremists online and offline, and learning that they can be very different than the person that they seem to be online or off.
Mm-hmm. So, let me just think about another thing here. So people seem more extreme online than they really are?
Yeah, let me give you an example. So one of the most interesting people we studied in the course of this book, we not only did large kind of data science studies using sophisticated machine learning techniques, but we also did in-depth interviews with a large group of Republicans and Democrats. Mm-hmm. And we got to know them both online and offline very well through this process. And the person who sticks out to my mind most is a guy I'll call Ray. And Ray is if you meet him, he'd describe himself as kind of a moderate Republican. But he says, he doesn't like when people argue about politics, and he's very polite, and he's very civil, and deferential, even kind when we talk to him. And so then we went to look him up online, and we discovered that Ray is like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He turns into one of the most extreme trolls on Twitter every night. He sends out about 10 memes, horrific stuff about Democrats mostly. And this is essentially an alternative life for him. And so the interesting question, I think, is like, why does he do this?
Mm-hmm. Right. And let me just ask you, why do you use the word prism? Why do you call it the social media prism?
Sure. So if we think about, let's answer that question first. Why does Ray do this? It's because he's getting reinforcement. He's learning from the social context that people like this. In fact, lots of people are liking and sharing these memes that he's creating, these really disgusting memes about Democrats. And so it's really communicating to him. Social media is we want it to be a mirror. We want it to use it to look at ourselves or the people around us and get an accurate sense of what's going on. But in this book, and the reason I call the book Breaking the Social Media Prism, is because it's really more of a prism that distorts our understanding of ourselves and each other. It communicates back to us often the most extreme parts of the ideological continuum and mutes moderates.
So now for a more normative question, should we fight against political polarization, and if so, how?
So I think that, personally, I think this is one of the most important questions that we can ask as societies right now. I think we need look no further than coronavirus to see what happens if we don't deal with polarization. You know, in the U.S., the debate was more or less, do we shut down completely, or do we go on accepting that, you know, mass death is going to happen and kind of save the economy? Now, people can make arguments for both sides, and of course people did, but the worst thing that can happen is if half the country is doing one of those things and the other half is doing the other, right? So we experience mass death and, you know, economic demise, right? So we could give many other examples of the downsides of polarization, everything from government dysfunction to health and mental well-being. But I think it's a really vital thing for all of us to think about. Now, solving polarization doesn't mean caving and you know, giving in to all of your most deeply held beliefs. And I think that in order to counter polarization, we need a two-pronged strategy. We need to both change the way that we behave on social media, and we also need help from social media companies themselves.
And talking about social media companies, is there any social media company out there who has already come up with a good strategy to fight back against political polarization and the spread of misinformation, for example?
Good question. You know, we really have to think about what social media is doing, right? What was it made for? We think about Facebook. Facebook was created to help undergraduates at Harvard University rate each other's physical attractiveness, right? Twitter was created for groups of friends to more effectively message each other. Instagram was created to help people, you know, basically drink alcohol together. You know, its original name was bourbon. So when we think about these platforms that were created to serve the needs of, you know, esoteric needs of small parts of the internet, and all of a sudden we expect them to be, you know, the public square for democracy in the 21st century, we're really kidding ourselves, right? There are no design principles in social media. We haven't designed for anything. We haven't even really thought about incivility and how the structure of the platforms shapes incivility or encourages incivility in intelligent ways. And part of the reason for that is it's very difficult to study these things. It's very difficult to say, you know, ask Facebook to profoundly change the way that its platform runs, right? Of course they can't do that. There's legal issues, public relations issues, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we did in the polarization lab that I run at Duke University was to create our own social media platform that we could control entirely. We could turn on and off different features. We can control who interacts on the platform and how, and try to, through this new forum for scientific research, understand what works and what doesn't work in depolarizing people.
Could you tell us more about that social media? It's called Discuss It, right?
Yes, yeah, this is the kind of lame name we gave it. We didn't want to call it, you know, the anti-echo chamber or something like that, because then we would only attract people who were predisposed to find political compromise. So we created an app, we put it in the App Store, we built a platform, and we paid people to use it. We gave them an invite code that, unbeknownst to them, paired them to discuss anonymously either immigration or gun control with a member of the other party. Now, in this first of what we hope will be many experiments, we made them anonymous to each other. And you may think, okay, well, anonymity is a dangerous thing, right? Earlier I was saying that because of anonymity, people can become extremists, right? They can disguise themselves and they can have this kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of transformation. On the other hand, anonymity also gives us the opportunity to explore new or maybe unpopular ideas without peer pressure, without fear of being sanctioned by people in our party or otherwise. So if you can imagine a Republican and a Democrat discussing gun control on Twitter, you know, if, let's say, the Democrat has slightly pro-gun views, it's very unlikely they're going to share it in this public forum. But what we discovered is when we pair people to discuss one of these two controversial issues in a fairly simple chat format over about an hour, that they depolarized substantially. They became much more likely to find compromise about immigration or gun control when we surveyed them before and after. And they also became much warmer towards people from the other political party. They seemed better able to empathize with people from the other party.
So with that knowledge, do you already have any good solutions that perhaps social media companies could implement to try to fight back against political polarization, etc.?
Yeah, so, I don't think we can expect, Facebook to go completely anonymous overnight, nor would we want it to, right? It has to be a carefully cultivated process that brings people together that we designed in our study. But one thing I think that would be most helpful, we spent so much time talking about the negative parts of social media, the way that it divides us, echo chambers, foreign misinformation campaigns, algorithms that radicalize us, right? And the research is becoming pretty clear. These things have a marginal effect on incivility, spread of misinformation, and so on and so forth. So instead of investing all of our energy in stopping the bad stuff, are there any ways that we can incentivize good behavior? And here, I think there's a real role for social media platforms to create new kinds of status that reward people for creating content that appeals to very diverse groups of people instead of only playing to one side of the aisle, or to reward people for promoting truthful information or trying to discredit misinformation, similar to Twitter's recent effort, Birdwatch, which is a crowdsourced initiative where people gain status for promoting truthful things and countering misinformation.
Mm-hmm. So, and when it comes specifically to misinformation, even if in social media in general, there's very little misinformation going around there. What about new media in comparison with mainstream media? Do we know if we find more misinformation there than in the mainstream media, for example?
Yeah, misinformation is a complicated term. It can mean many things to different people, right? It could mean falsehoods, things that aren't true. Right. It could mean misleading information. It could mean selective accounts. And I think, depending on which one of those we were talking about, we might have a very different answer. So, for example, many people would probably criticize a lot of new media sources, blogs, and other kind of political, one thinks of like Breitbart or sites of this nature that might provide highly selective accounts of what's going on. Sometimes they include falsehoods, but more often it's just highly selective accounting. So with regard to falsehoods, I think the thing that we should all be watching is the lawsuit from the Venezuelan voter machine company that's currently pending against Fox News, which will, I think, litigate this issue of whether or not falsehoods can be differentiated from kind of selective reporting, and what consequence that will have for these large corporations who control media outlets, and whether they will be perhaps more reluctant to spread falsehoods or other types of misinformation in the wake of this case.
Mm-hmm. Are people who are politically moderate, are they muted online or not?
Yeah, this is another really fascinating thing we learned from the research for this book. When you go on social media, you are encountering, most likely, very extreme people from the other side. And it can seem as if there are no moderates on social media. Mm-hmm. And what we discovered in our research is that there are actually lots of moderates. In fact, most people never talk about politics on social media. And that's hard to remember if you're the type of person who cares enough, to read a book about polarization or to watch a YouTube video about polarization, right? Actually, most people don't care very much. So, but there are also moderates who care and whose views aren't expressed. And those people, I think, are most important. So let me tell you the story of a woman I'll call Sarah. Sarah is a moderate conservative woman, and one night she was up late on Twitter, and she saw a post by the National Rifle Association, the lobbying group that supports handgun ownership and weapon ownership in the U.S. And her husband is the type of guy who goes to a gun range and he practices, and he's a responsible gun owner, she says online. And within minutes, she tells us, people had discovered that she had children by looking at her other Twitter account and said to her in a reply to her tweet, "I hope your children find your gun and shoot you." And this experience, being harassed online, is actually now become the most common reason people are harassed online for their political views. So people like Sarah actually have very nuanced and moderate views. She's half Puerto Rican. She's from New York City. Her father was a police officer. So she understands both sides of the debate about things like police violence or gun control. She actually has very important views, I think, that are just completely invisible online. So the problem is, when I write in this book that the social media prism is fueling extremism, right, by giving incentive to social outcasts like that guy Rayo was talking about to engage in increasingly extreme behavior, it also means that expressing political views for moderates like Sarah is a liability, right? She has no real reason to go out on a limb. She's worried about her kids.
Yeah, and that could have some bad social consequences for moderates. I mean, sometimes people can even get ostracized.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, Sarah and her family, we tell the story in the book about an aunt who she can no longer speak to because they got into such a large argument during the Trump presidency on Twitter. So social media really is ruining relationships. And I think that's one thing that, most people I know have a story about an uncle, an aunt, a brother, a sister, who they became, tense with as a result of some political discussion on social media.
Mhm. But why does that happen? Is it because people who are more politically engaged tend to not trust people who are more moderate? Because, I mean, maybe they have some sort of agenda against their ideology or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we think about it, if these extremists are being rewarded for engaging in extreme behavior, right, that's part of their sense of identity, right, that they are a
Right.
strong Republican or a strong progressive liberal. And so they experience any attack on their party as an attack on themselves. And so even if a moderate, says something, not too partisan or maybe questions the orthodoxy of their side a little bit, it can be experienced as an attack on identity. And in fact, there's an interesting study done by Facebook scientists where they looked at people and asked them kind of, why were you sharing a piece of information that you shared in the course of this context that they were studying? And what they discovered is that people very often think they are simply sharing facts with each other. This happened
Right.
or this doesn't happen. But the people involved in the conversation don't experience that as fact sharing. They experience it as opinion sharing. And so, what we try to be on social media can often be very different than what we actually appear to be to others. And that's where this prism effect becomes so important. This is how incivility can spread. And this is why learning how to change our own behavior is, I think, paramount and probably the area where we can make the most scalable gains in defeating polarization online.
So it's mostly about identity. For example, the specific content of people's beliefs is secondary or not?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to understand that when we go online and we interact with people from the other side or we see people from the other side, it's very likely that those people have extreme views and that they are not representative of the other side. So in other words, we need to learn how to see the social media prism. And, in a book like mine, that can sound like kind of self-help advice, right? That we all just need to become more aware, and that's the answer, right? But obviously, that's hard to do. We all kind of snap back into our habits on social media. And so one of the big efforts that I made in writing this book was to create a series of public tools that people can use to try to become more aware of the social media prism. So one tool that your viewers can use on polarizationlab.com is a tool that allows you to detect the likelihood that someone's a troll. We call it the trollometer. And basically, you can put in information about the user who you're interacting with, and then see, according to our research, which is informed by large analyses of many different people over time, the likelihood that this person is a troll. You can also learn the types of terms that trolls use. You can, in other words, hopefully learn to distinguish extremists from moderates.
Can fact-checking tools or websites help here or not?
You know, I certainly think that fact checking has a role. One thing that was surprising in the research for this book was an encounter I had with a woman named Janet. So Janet is an extremely strong Republican. She voted for Trump. She spends hours each day defending Trump online, or at least she used to. And we had this interesting exchange. You may remember years ago, there was a caravan of migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border, and there was a viral image that was shared of a young mother who had a canister of tear gas shot at her by U.S. border agents. And we, in the course of our interviews, we were talking about events like these, and I brought this up in this interview, and Janet said, "Oh, well, Obama did that too." And I thought, this doesn't seem right to me. Obama was a champion of human rights. He had done so much for immigrants. He had really criticized his predecessor, George W. Bush, for human rights abuses. Could he really have attacked people in this way? And I discovered in the course that then she says, go to Snopes.com, the fact-checking site, to look at it. And sure enough, she was using Snopes.com, even an extreme Republican. So in that case, I was the one getting the education about fact-checking. But it shows that it does have an effect on people like Janet. And she even gave me several examples where she herself, toned down her language after discovering that she had actually been duped by some fake news or misinformation.
So just one last question. Since we're going through this pandemic, are some of these online phenomena we've been talking about, have they been exacerbated in this context or not?
When I first realized the scale and gravity of the COVID pandemic, I, like everyone, was, worried. But on the other hand, I hoped there was some opportunity. That is, for years, people have thought that if we had a common enemy in the United States, then it would help us overcome polarization. It would convince us that the issues that divide us are less severe than the issues that might unite us to confront something like a once-in-a-century pandemic. And so, interestingly, in the early days of the pandemic, if we look back at survey research, there was actually a lot of consensus about the need for social distancing, the need for closing the borders, and so on and so forth. Now, that changed in the months afterwards, right? It became a political issue. And it became a political issue in large part, I think, through the power of the social media prism. So even though we had already interviewed all the people in the book at this point, we were able to go back and revisit the people that I've discussed with you today, some of the extremists, some of the moderates. And sure enough, the extremists were sharing, conspiracy theories about, China's role in spreading the virus. And moderates were talking about video games or sports. They were completely disengaged, leaving again the impression that, say, every Democrat wanted to shut down the country forever, and every Republican wanted to, never wear a mask, right? And so clearly the middle just dropped out of the conversation. And I think, unfortunately, we saw throughout the pandemic, especially the later stages of the pandemic, that the power of the social media prism was as strong as ever.
Okay, so again, the book is Breaking the Social Media Prism, How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing. Dr. Bale, just before we go, would you like to mention where people can find you on the internet?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Chris_Bale. You can check out more of our research at polarizationlab.com. And you can check out those tools I mentioned, not only the trollometer, but a leaderboard that ranks people according to the extent that their tweets get resonance with members of both parties, or bots that allow you to step outside your echo chamber in the right way. So we'd love to engage with your audience and see you on polarizationlab.com.
Great. Okay, so it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview. The show is brought to you by people like you, so consider doing it. Otherwise, and if you like the interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, KARIN, LIETZCKE and BLANCHETTE, LARSEN, GUERREIRO, Francis Ford, FREDRIK, SUNDE, RICARDO, VLADIMIRO, Craig, HEALY, Adam, KESSEL, OLAF, Alex, Jonathan, VISSER, JAKOB, KLINKBY, Matthew, WHITINGBIRD, ARNAUD, WOLFF, Tim, HOLLOSY, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Pauline Baron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Muller, Herbert GINTIS, RUTGER Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windagan, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omer Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslo Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila DEZA-ARAUJO, Ethan Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz. My producers is Arweb, Jim, Frank, Lucas Staffinia, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Muller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirvan Balachandran. And my executive producers, Michel Rzeski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.